In 1898, white supremacists in Wilmington, North Carolina killed over 300 African Americans and forced thousands to leave their homes, including my own family. My grandma's great-grandparents, Ephraim and Sally, had been in the Wilmington area since about the 40s or 50s, and even during their time before the end of enslavement, Wilmington wasn't a bad place for a black person in America to be. There was already a free upper class of Africans in Wilmington. Some people were free domestic servants, and even some skilled workers in things like artisans. My grandmother's grandmother, Sarah Aiken, was born in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1893. Her brother Andrew was born in Wilmington in 1896. But by the 1900 census, the whole family had packed up and moved to Georgia, and a lot changed between these years. Only about 30 years after over 200,000 African men and women fought in the Civil War for our freedom, Wilmington was a booming place, and especially for black people. The population of Wilmington was over 20,000, and there was a slight majority of black people. But pretty much for any white-owned business that you could find, there was a black version too. 10 out of the 11 restaurants in the city were black-owned. 20 out of the 22 barbershops were black-owned, and about half of the tailors were black too. We also made up about 35% of the service positions in the city and about 30% of the skilled craftsmen. Alexander and Frank Manley, two brothers from Wilmington, also owned the Wilmington Daily Record, one of the biggest newspapers period in the whole state, and one of the only black newspapers at the time that was running daily. People like Robert Abbott with the Chicago Defender and Alexander Manley with his Daily Record in Wilmington have always been important to the black community as something that can reverse the effects of the propaganda coming from the other side of the media, and somebody who could speak for black people in the public and in the press. Because of their lighter skin and rather fair race relations in Wilmington, white companies would actually put a lot of money into the Daily Record and run things like advertisements. There was also a few extremely wealthy black men in the area, like Frederick C. Sadwar, a Lincoln University educated architect who would teach newly freed men in Wilmington the trade of carpentry. Also John C. Dancy, a black man who worked as the U.S. Collector of Customs at the Wilmington Port, one of the most important jobs in the whole city. He made about $4,000 a year at the time. That's equivalent to about $135,000 a year in today's money. As well as Thomas C. Miller, the wealthiest black man in the city. He was one of the 3 real estate agents in the entire city, and he was also the only pawnbroker. So there were a lot of white and black people who owed money to him. Just like today, the people at the top don't tell the whole story. Even though there was the upper class of black people, the average black person in Wilmington wasn't doing all that great, but better than pretty much anywhere else. After 200 years of enslavement and forced free labor, it was rare for any Africans in America to have any type of inheritance. And after the fraud by white men in the Freedmen's Bureau Bank, over 30,000 of us lost all of our savings from the Civil War and the money that we did earn from fighting for our own freedom. Not only that, but usually black people in Wilmington wouldn't be allowed to pay for things in installments, and their interest rates would be about 15% compared to about 7% for white people. Because of all of these things, only about 8% of the black population in Wilmington actually owned any property, and the per capita wealth for the black population in Wilmington was about $30 per person compared to $550 per person for the white population. A lot like today, this illusion from outside that black people are all prospering and doing well compared to the reality that only about 8% of us own property led to a class divide within the white community as well. A lot of the poor white people will look at these prospering black people and feel like they didn't deserve it because of their skin color, and especially when there was white people who are still poor. And a writer for the New York Times pretty much summed up the attitude of most rich white people at the time. He wrote and published, "The Negro in Wilmington has progressed in very slight degree from the time when he was a slave. His condition can be summed up in a line. Of the taxes in the city of Wilmington and the county of New Hanover, the whites pay 96 2/3%, while the Negroes pay the remainder, 3 1/3%. The Negro in North Carolina, as these figures show, is thriftless, improvident, does not accumulate money, and is not accounted a desirable citizen." This idea of holding us back while also telling us that we suck and aren't going forward is nothing new and something that's been happening since we got out the boats. Also, this idea of measuring a human being and their worth by the amount of money that they bring in is something that's directly tied to the transatlantic slave trade, and is something that's especially dangerous to the African American community. It ties into W.E.B. Du Bois' theory of double consciousness. If you're African American in America and you're judging yourself based on the amount of money you make, the system sets it up so that you have the less money out of anybody, so you're obviously going to look at yourself as lower and the people around you as lower if you're ranking by money. Even though the economic power within Wilmington wasn't evenly spread out throughout the black community, we all had one vote and over 80% of us went to the polls and used it, mostly for the Republican Party. And the poor whites in Wilmington, they pretty much realized that they wasn't much better off than us. We was all in the same debt, sharecropping on the same plantations. They started a populist or People's Party, and they came together with the Republicans to form something called the Fusion Party. So in the 1894 and 1896 elections, the poor white fusionists and the black Republicans, who already made up the majority, came together and voted as a bloc and also elected political candidates as a bloc. They pretty much swept every election across the whole state. And that's when in 1897, the Secret nine prominent white men from North Carolina came together to make their plan to reinstate white supremacy in North Carolina and de-establish Negro rule. They were beat on pretty much all the issues by the fusionists, but they needed something that could cross party lines and get white people to come back to the Democratic Party and leave the Republicans. The leader of the Democratic Party was quoted saying, "There is but one chance and but one hope for the railroads to capture the net legislator, and that is for the nigger to be made the issue." They decided if they couldn't get it in the real world, they were just going to make race the problem and make people feel like they were in danger from these new black people in power so they could get their power back. They decided that three things were needed in order to reestablish white supremacy: writers who could write propaganda and put things in the media, speakers who could give a good speech and get people riled up, and riders, white men who were able to get on a horse and go intimidate or even kill anyone who opposed them. They first needed writers. Many people still weren't even literate, so they depended on the newspaper for all of their information. They published many cartoons depicting black people as dangerous, monkeys, and incompetent, not able to lead. And they also needed speakers who could give speeches. Some of the speeches went along the lines of, "North Carolina is a white man's state, and white men will rule it. And they will crush the party of Negro domination beneath a majority so overwhelming that no other party will ever dare to attempt to establish Negro rule here again." The party leader also said in one of his speeches, "It will be the meanest, vilest, dirtiest campaign since 1876. The slogan of the Democratic Party from the mountains to the sea would be but one word: nigger." They also needed riders. A new group of young white men named the Redcoats popped up as pretty much an alternative to the KKK in North Carolina. Instead of wearing white robes and covering their faces, they wore their red coats, and they did most of their things in broad daylight. They also started something called the White Laborers Union, a group of white workers who were protesting against having black co-workers in an attempt to try and secure jobs for white men in the state. After the Civil War, a lot of white people ended up just as poor as we was and had to get out there on those same plantations and sharecrop that same tobacco and that same cotton. And a lot of people didn't feel like that was something that was beneficial to the white society, and it was especially dangerous to the pure white women who had to be out there with those black savages. One prominent white woman in particular was extremely against it. I won't even give her the benefit of saying her name, but if you want to look her up, she was the first congressperson to be a woman in America. She gave a speech at Tybee Island talking about, "When there is not enough religion in the pulpit to organize a crusade against sin, nor justice in the courthouse to promptly punish crime, nor manhood enough in the nation to put a sheltering of arm about innocence and virtue, if it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possession from the ravening human beasts, then I say lynch, 1,000 times a week if necessary." Now, if you remember Alexander Manly, this is where he comes back in. And a lot of people feel like this is the turning point and when things went violent. A lot of black people at the time even blamed things on Manly. He responded in his own newspaper by saying, "Every Negro lynched is called a big burly black brute," when in fact, many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers. They were not only not black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is very known to all. Looking back on it today, we all know he didn't say nothing wrong. Even his grandfather had raped his grandmother, who was an enslaved African, and white men have been raping our women since they first got on the boats. And white women have also been fetishizing black men since they first got on the boats. But we all know how they do. They took that and ran with it. They painted it as the worst disrespect ever and basically called for him to be lynched. A lot of people in the black community, some of the prominent black people, they even turned against him and said that he was out of place. And some people even justified the next actions by the white supremacists because of Manley's actions. The violence started on October 28th. They held a Democratic convention in the eastern part of the state, the more racist part of the state, in Goldsboro, North Carolina. 8,000 people showed up, and the leader of the rally gave a speech going along the lines of, "The Anglo-Saxon planted civilization on this continent, and wherever this race has been in conflict with another race, it has asserted its supremacy and either conquered or exterminated the foe. The great race has carried its Bible in one hand and the sword in the other. Resist our march of progress and civilization, and we will wipe you off the face of earth." He ended the speech by saying that they would banish any of the blacks and any of the traders who aided with them, even if they had to stop up the river with enough black bodies. Now, we all know he was lying. Them folks didn't even know how to wash when we first found them. But all of the people that was there, they took it and ran with it. And some of those red shirts that I talked about earlier, they went to the black neighborhoods in Goldsboro in the eastern part of the state and started tearing stuff up immediately. Then a few days later, on November 1st in Wilmington, thousands of white men, they came together and paraded through the black neighborhoods. They didn't do nothing this time, and they paraded until they got to their headquarters. The next day they came with even more people, and this time they actually shot into homes and schools and even a church. At the end, once they got to their headquarters, there was a big barbecue, and their leader gave another speech. In this speech, he said, "All the soldiers in the United States will not keep white people from enjoying their rights. And if a Negro constable comes to a white man with a warrant in his hand, he should leave with a bullet in his brain." They also revealed their brand new Gatling gun that was eventually to be used in the massacre. Their main strategy now is to prevent black people from even trying to vote. They would go around town pretty much telling everybody, if the Republicans and the populists win, then it's going to be war. They would put in the newspaper that it was pretty much inevitable for a massacre to happen, and they just wanted everybody to be scared. Some black men tried to defend themselves and go and buy guns, even out of the state. Any black man who did try and go buy a gun was denied, and his name was also given to the Democratic Party. In the same week that they denied every black man from buying a gun, they sold over 400 weapons to white men. The night before the election, their leader gave one more speech. He said, "You are Anglo-Saxons. You are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find a Negro out voting, tell him to lead the polls. And if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks. We shall win tomorrow if we have to do it with guns." On the day of the election, pretty much all the black people decided they wasn't going to vote to avoid violence. Pretty much every polling booth was guarded by an armed white supremacist, and they also blocked every road in and out of town. But this was only one election, and they didn't have all the power, so they decided to go even further. They went to where all the elected officials were at with guns, and the rules were that if you were to resign, then your peers and the people who worked with you would replace you instead of a vote. So they forced everybody to resign, and they replaced themselves. And the leader who was giving all these racist speeches, they elected him as the new mayor of Wilmington. The next day on November 9th, 600 white supremacists came together to create a new white Declaration of Independence. They felt like the original Constitution never expected for black people to have any type of power, so they had to amend it and make sure that black people would never be able to vote again, have a job again, pretty much to put them back as subservient citizens. They decided they was going to implement things like poll taxes and literacy tests to stop black people from voting, but that actually affected poor white people too, so they had to start things like the grandfather clause that said if your grandpa didn't vote before the Civil War, when black people were still slaves, then you couldn't vote now. That same day they met with 32 prominent black men and decided to make them give them a response by the morning. The response went along the lines of, "We, the colored citizens to whom was referred the matter of expulsion from the community of the person and press of Alexander Manley, beg most respectfully to say that we are in no way responsible for, nor in any way do we condone, the obnoxious article that called forth their actions. Neither are we authorized to act for him in this manner, but in the interest of peace, we will most willingly use our influence to have your wishes carried out." So they pretty much just said, do what y'all want to do with Manley. We know that he was done for saying it, and that don't have nothing to do with us. And I respect it, but I don't think it was the right thing to do. But the next day, the white supremacists, they went to Manley's office looking for him, but they didn't know that he had escaped the night before. So when his white friends actually gave him the password to get past one of the guards, and remember his grandpa was a white man, so he still was real light-skinned, and he was able to pass for white and get past the guard. The guard even invited him and his friends to the lynching the next day. While they was burning down Manly building, a rumor spread that a black man actually had defended himself and shot back against one of the white armed guards. This made thousands of white men go to the Brooklyn neighborhood of Wilmington, where most of the black people live, and just started killing anybody that they saw. You had to have a pass to get past, and one black man, Reverend J. Allen Kirk, gave his own account of what happened. He said, "It was a great sight to see them marching from death, and the colored women, colored men, colored children, colored enterprises, and colored people all exposed to death. Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks and screams of children, of mothers, of wives were heard, such as caused the blood of the most inhuman person to creep. Thousands of women, children, and men rushed to the swamps and there lay upon the earth in the cold to freeze and starve. The woods were filled with colored people. The streets were dotted with their dead bodies. A white gentleman said that he saw 10 bodies lying in the undertaker's office at one time. Some of their bodies were left lying in the streets until up in the next day following the riot. Some were found by the stench and miasma that came forth from their decaying bodies under their houses. Every colored man who passed through the streets had either to be guarded by one of the crowd or have a paper giving him the right to pass. All colored men at the cotton press and oil mills were ordered not to leave their labor but stop there, while their wives and children were shrieking and crying in the midst of the flying balls and in sight of cannons and Gatling guns. All the white people had gone out to that part of the city. This army of men marched through the streets, sword buckled to their sides, giving the command to fire. Men stood at their labor, wringing their hands and weeping, but they dared not move to the protection of their homes. And then when they passed through the streets, had to hold up their hands and be searched. The little white boys of the city searched them and took from them every means of defense, and if they resisted, they were shot down. The city was under military rule. No Negro was allowed to come into the city without being examined or without passing through with his boss, for whom he labored. Colored women were examined and their hats were taken off, and search was made even under their clothing. They went from house to house looking for Negroes that they considered offensive, took arms that they had hidden, and killed them for the least expression of manhood. They gathered around colored homes, firing like great sportsmen firing at rabbits in an open field, and when one would jump his man, from 60 to 100 shots would be turned loose upon him. His escape was impossible. One fellow was walking along a railroad and they shot him down without any provocation. It is said by an eyewitness that men lay upon the street dead and dying, while members of their race walked by helpless and unable to do them any good or their families. Negro stores were closed and the owners thereof driven out of the city and even shipped away at the point of the gun. Some of the churches were searched for ammunition, and cannons turned toward the door in the attitude of blowing up the church if the pastor or officers did not open them that they might go through. The white supremacists had pulled off the only successful coup d'etat on American soil in history. And after, of course, they painted themselves as the victors and the ones who saved themselves from impending danger from the Negroes. Every cartoon painted black people as the aggressors, even though no white people even died in the entire massacre. They tried to paint it as a riot or a war, but it was really a massacre. It was over 90 years until the next black person was elected to the North Carolina state legislature, and it wasn't until the early 2000s that the state of North Carolina even investigated. Those of us who survived and were able to return to Wilmington asked the governor of North Carolina for help in rebuilding the black neighborhoods, and they were ignored. When they went directly to the White House for help, the White House said that the governor had to send a request. Ever since the massacre and thousands of black people like my family left Wilmington, it has never been a majority black town again, and the current population of black people today is only about 18%. I can't imagine the type of trauma that my ancestors had to go through dealing with this, but I feel like these strong stories of our perseverance and the things we had to go through are an integral part of rebuilding our education in order to rebuild our community. If you want to help me on this journey, leave a like and subscribe. And if you have any recommendations for future videos, leave them in the comments. Peace.